Good afternoon, and on behalf of the Center for Democracy and Technology, or CDT, thank you for joining us today. My name is Samir Jain, and I'm the Vice President of Policy here at CDT. For those of you not familiar with us, CDT is a nonprofit 501c3 organization that's been fighting to advance civil rights and civil liberties in the digital age. Established in 1994, CDT has been a trusted advocate for digital rights since the earliest days of the internet, including specifically in the area of privacy, which has been central to our mission throughout. Today's event is focused on privacy in the communications sector. Communications companies collect a wide array of data about us, everything from where we go to whom we call. Thus, the rules that govern that privacy are critical. Today, we'll be talking about those, the state of play, the role of the FTC, and ways we might better protect communications privacy. There's no better person to kick off this discussion than FCC Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel, who we're delighted to welcome to our office. She'll give opening remarks, after which I'll return to moderate a panel of experts to offer some reactions to what she has to say and to discuss the issues further. There will be an opportunity for you all to ask questions of the panel as well toward the end. With that, let me briefly introduce Chairman Rosenworcel. She's worked in the communications sector for over 2 decades. After a stint in private practice, she began her illustrious public service career when she joined the FCC, first in the Wireline Competition Bureau, and then in the Office of Commissioner Copps. She next served as Senior Communications Counsel in the Senate for the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee. President Obama subsequently nominated her to the FCC, and she was confirmed in 2012. She has been a commissioner at the FCC since and assumed the chairwomanship in 2021. Throughout her career, Chairwoman Rosenworcel has been a strong advocate for the consumer, from expanding the reach and affordability of telecommunications and broadband services to promoting net neutrality and privacy. We're honored to have Chairwoman Rosenworcel join us today and look forward to her remarks.
Thank you so much, Samir. It's good to be here. Thank you to the Center for Democracy and Technology for hosting this forum and for all you do to bring people together, I think big thoughts about issues like communications privacy. And I really also want to thank the panel of experts who are going to be joining us after my remarks. We need more people working on these matters and more discussion. And today we're going to do some of that. All right. Let me start at the very beginning because I want to talk about what I think is at stake with communications privacy. I think it's important to recognize that we've got some pretty powerful forces shaping our digital world. And from where I sit, I see 3. First, we live in an era of always-on connectivity. Connection is no longer just convenient. It fuels every aspect of modern civic and commercial life. Sitting outside this connectivity means shutting yourself off from any shot at 21st century success. But too often, this always-on connectivity, which has brought so many benefits, can require a sacrifice of our privacy. Second, the monetization of big data is big business. The cost of data storage has declined dramatically. The market incentives to keep our data and slice and dice it to inform commercial activity are enormous, and they are only growing. Third, more money means more players. It used to be that in the communications sector, the relationship was primarily between a customer and his or her service provider. But the number of third parties participating in our digital age connections has multiplied. Dial a call, write an email, make a purchase, update a profile, peruse a news site, or store something in the cloud. You can bet that service providers, advertising networks, and companies specializing in analytics have access to your personal information, lots of it, for a long time. So we see these 3 forces over and over and over again at the FCC. So let me give you an example. Roll back to May of 2018. That's when the New York Times first reported that the country's largest wireless carriers were selling real-time location information. That means where we are with our phones and when, to data aggregators. It was pretty alarming stuff. Over time, with additional reporting and an investigation from the FCC, a fuller picture of what was going on started to emerge. So it turns out Wireless carriers had sold access to individual real-time geolocation data. Again, that's where we are with our phones and when. And they'd sold it to data aggregators. These aggregators had then sold it to a skip tracing firm, who then sold it to a bail bond company, who then sold it off to individual bounty hunters. Got that? Yeah, it sounds crazy because it is. But what it meant is that when this article was written, just about anyone could pay $300 to a bounty hunter and get information about when and where you were using your mobile phone. That is the kind of sacrifice of privacy no one should expect when they sign up for wireless service. But it does show those three forces at work, how our most important connections can be monetized, and how the business of gathering our data has expanded exponentially. All right, let me give you another example. Over and over again, we are seeing reports of data breaches involving the data carriers have about their customers. Just 3 months ago, one carrier notified 9 million customers that some of their personal information had been accessed by an unauthorized party. The hacker got this information by compromising the system of a vendor that the carrier used for marketing. At the start of the year, another carrier reported that an intruder in its system had stolen data on 37 million of its customers. And this report came on the heels of an earlier breach of personal information of more than 75 million current, former, and prospective customers from the same carrier. That's a lot. These forces are powerful. You can do the math. The numbers really add up. All right, one more example. Late last year, we had a carrier notify an undisclosed number of its prepaid wireless customers that they'd been targeted by SIM swapping attacks. Now, as most of this audience knows, SIM swapping is an increasingly popular scam. But for the uninitiated, SIM cards are those small plastic chips about the size of a dime that are inserted into a mobile phone, and they help identify and authenticate the subscriber. So here's how the scam works. A bad actor, often using sensitive information that they got from one of those data breaches, calls up your wireless provider and uses that information to convince the customer service representative that they really are you, and they really need your phone number switched to a new SIM card that they control. If they're successful, they can then use your phone number to divert your incoming messages and easily complete that kind of two-factor authentication checks that we all need for financial institutions and social media accounts. So that means they can take over your email and drain your bank account. Again, this kind of fraud demonstrates how powerful these forces are and how privacy is so important for communications and digital age trust. And if you need further evidence, consider this. There's a recent Pew survey out there that found that half of Americans have chosen not to use a product or service because of privacy concerns. Half. That's a problem, and I think it's incumbent on policymakers to take action, using whatever tools they have to improve privacy and enhance digital age trust. So here's what we're working on at the Federal Communications Commission right now to do just that. So I think the agency has an important role to play ensuring the privacy of consumer communications. The Communications Act provides us with clear communications privacy authority, and you'll find it in sections 222 and 631 of the law. But in light of the magnitude of the privacy challenges we're facing, I think we're going to have to concentrate our efforts at the agency and give them new focus. So that's why I'm pleased to announce we're creating a first ever Privacy and Data Protection Task Force at the Commission. We are going to bring all of our technical and legal experts together from across the agency to maximize coordination and use the law to reach results by evolving our policies and taking enforcement action. This task force is going to be led by Loyan Igal, who is our chief of the Enforcement Bureau. And under his watch, I should note, we've already doubled the number of people working on privacy and data security investigations. Now we're going to bring new form to these efforts. So this task force is going to have input in several ongoing efforts at the agency. These include an effort to modernize the FCC's data breach rules. They are due for a digital age update. They were last modernized more than 15 years ago. And we proposed just that in a recent rulemaking. And they need to be fine-tuned because we've got to address the kind of data breaches I was talking about just a moment ago. And we're also going to charge this group with overseeing the investigations and enforcement actions that have followed those data breaches. On top of that, the task force is going to help with the development of rules to crack down on SIM swapping fraud. We have a rulemaking that has proposed standards for carriers to authenticate a customer before transferring a number to a new device or a new carrier. And we're going to follow up and adopt new rules and put them in place to put a stop to these scams. The task force is also going to play a role in our work under the Safe Connections Act. And this is important. This was a law passed late last year to help support access to communications for survivors of domestic violence. They have real vulnerabilities when it comes to calling a lifeline for help or security, and they've got real challenges when it comes to setting up new phone accounts to separate from anyone who might be abusing them. I'm proud of the work the agency has done to date on that, but we're going to do even more with the task force in place. And we're going to be asking the task force to take a look at the data that I am asked last year when I just personally wrote the 15 largest mobile carriers, asking information about their geolocation data retention and privacy practices. That shouldn't be revelatory, but it turned out the FCC had never done that before. So I did something when I got those responses. I made every one of them public. And now we have investigations underway to follow up on this data gathering, and the task force is going to assume responsibility for those efforts. Finally, today, with the help of the task force, I'm going to share with my colleagues a proposed enforcement action against 2 companies that have put the security of communications customers at risk. It's an enforcement action, so I can't say more right now, but I can say this right out of the gate. We are showing that this task force means business. So now let me close with something I mentioned when I began, and that's holding wireless carriers accountable for allowing our location data to be bought and sold on the black market. This is so important. The devices we carry in our palms, our pockets, and our purses know an awful lot about us. They know our whereabouts at any given moment. And this geolocation data, I think it's especially sensitive. It is a record of where we have been, and even more fundamentally, it's a record of who we are. In the wrong hands, a stalker or a criminal, it can put our privacy, and more than that, even our physical security at risk. Now, back in 2020, the FCC actually took enforcement action against the carriers for selling and sharing this geolocation data. It issued notices of apparent liability that help stop this ugly practice. But I think it's time to back that up with forfeiture orders and fines. It's time to hold them accountable and make them pay for this behavior. And by that, I mean the more than $200 million in fines proposed by the prior administration. So let me call on my colleagues to bring this chapter to a close by finalizing these fines and voting for those forfeiture orders I have shared with you. We need to make clear that when you violate consumer communications privacy, there are consequences. Now, in the end, I think the most consequential thing we can do is keep working on this issue, because the digital age privacy challenges we face, they're just not going to go away. The forces behind them are too powerful and move too much of what we understand to be modern life. That means right now we need to use the law, and whatever laws we have, we need to evolve our policies and approach privacy and data security with new vigor. We need to look for every way to increase consumer trust and confidence, because if we do, we can ensure the benefits of this new digital world do more than just exceed its burdens. We can make communications private, safe, and secure. So let's do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Rosenworcel, for those thoughtful remarks. Can everyone hear me? Oh, yep. Okay, great. Appreciate your visiting and your thoughtful remarks and look forward to seeing what results from the task force in terms of privacy. And we're going to have the panelists talk about their reactions to your remarks in a moment. But before I do, let me introduce our panelists. We're fortunate to be joined by a group of real experts with a lot of experience on privacy and communications for today. So let me briefly introduce them. First, we have Harold Feld, who's the Senior Vice President at Public Knowledge and author of the book, The Digital Platform Act, which explains what the government can do to preserve competition and empower consumers in the age of big tech. Harold has been practicing law in both the public and private sectors for more than 20 years. Next, Katrina Fitzgerald. She's Deputy Director at the Electronic Privacy Information Center, or EPIC, where she leads the development of EPIC's policy agenda, advocates for stronger privacy and algorithmic accountability measures. Previously, Katrina served as Chief of Staff to a Massachusetts state senator. Adrienne Fowler is a partner at the law firm HWG, where she co-chairs the data privacy practice and is also a member of the telecom practice, where she primarily advises communications at technology companies. Adrienne previously was a trial attorney in the Department of Justice's Consumer Protection Branch. And then finally, Cody Vensky, who's Senior Policy Counsel for Surveillance, Privacy, and Technology at the ACLU, but importantly also an alum of CDT, having served as senior counsel and worked on equity and privacy issues in education and other civic technology. Cody also previously worked at the FCC. So thank you again, for all of you, for joining us. We're lucky to have you. Let me just begin by asking for each of your reactions to Chair Rosenworcel's remarks. Any thoughts? Any thoughts that you might have? If someone wants to jump in.
Well, sure. I'll start. First of all, I have to say that I totally join with Chair Rosenworcel in calling on her colleagues to finalize the forfeiture order. This has been outstanding. It is something that the original notice of apparent liability received bipartisan support, and the only dissents were the Democrats, who complained that the fines weren't strong enough. The behavior was egregious. I can't imagine what the holdout is or who is the reluctant commissioner, but the time is long past for them to move on it. As to the substance of the remark, I will just say briefly, I'm very glad to see this kind of a task force. The chairwoman has always been concerned about the FCC's privacy jurisdiction and defender of privacy. But while I think the history of enforcement at the FCC has had kind of an up and down, there are times when the FCC has been very aggressive, times when it seems to be lost in the agency. And so I'm hopeful that this kind of a task force will produce both necessary focus and really elevate the issue within the agency.
Great. Others?
Yeah, I'll second that we couldn't agree with the chairwoman more, that the FCC really needs to move forward on those forfeiture orders against the mobile carriers. It's just past time for that to happen. It's been 3 years. Glad to see the creation of the task force. Hopefully renewed focus on privacy at the agency. Especially appreciate, the idea that the task force will focus on the Safe Connections Act. The FCC has made some great moves there. Their willingness to address stalkerware, which is, kind of beyond the scope of what Congress required, but it's very relevant to survivors of domestic violence, has been great. We want to continue to work with the FCC to ensure that we're minimizing the barriers to make sure that survivors can easily use the program. So I'm glad that, there'll be a group focused on that, and happy to hear the creation of that task force.
Great. Adrienne or Cody, any just top line reactions?
Sure. And let me start off by saying, as the only one in private practice currently on this panel, that all of my remarks today are mine alone and not the positions of any of my clients and whatnot. I can't speak to any specific action that the chairwoman referenced, but I will say that I work with companies that are going to honor trust of consumers, that typically speaking, that's the goal of the FCC, that's the goal of industry, and that there's also a shared enabling consumers to harness the benefits of technology, things like being able to track folks for elder safety, being able to track folks for children safety and emergency response. And I think that one of the hopefully benefits of a task force will be enabling the FCC to have a focus group of individuals that can make the kind of nuanced decisions about individual uses of individual types of information, so that they can approach things, because the old privacy maxim of don't be creepy is highly fact specific. I don't like coupons, so if I am walking around a mall and someone is using my location information to send me a coupon of a store I'm about to walk into, I find that creepy. Someone else who's very into coupons might not find that creepy. And so looking at the sort of the varying issues of consent, of consumer trust, of appropriate notice, and also what the benefits consumers are of use of information is all going to be really important, and hopefully approached with the degree of nuance that it deserves.
Cody.
I'd just like to lift up the chairwoman's call to keep working on this matter. It's not just a matter for the FCC, but for other executive agencies and for Congress as well. And the sort of data that we saw flowing through the anecdotes that the chairwoman shared comes from a variety of sources and under a variety of different privacy laws, but for the most part, they're premised on a fiction of notice and consent that you've chosen by using a service for your data to collect in this way. And I think it's the stories the chairwoman shared underscore that it's time to rethink that model and go to a model of data minimization, where the data that's collected on this is data we would expect for the service that we're asking for. So I applaud her call that we should keep working on this.
Great, thanks, Cody. So let's go with that in terms of, you mentioned there are lots of different agencies and different laws that can be relevant here. Let's focus in a little bit on the FCC and sort of what authorities it actually has in this area. The chairwoman, I think, mentioned sections 222 and 631. Adrian, can you unpack a little bit more? What are the scope of the FCC's authorities in the privacy area?
Sure, and I'm going to try to explain this in as neutral of a way as possible, because I think that they're disputed. But Section 222 covers primarily what's known as consumer proprietary network information. And what that is information that's related to the duration, use, destination, and other technical information related to the use of telecommunication services. Under the current law, the provision of broadband internet access service is not a telecommunication service within Title II. The chairwoman has articulated a position where collection of information that's used both for the provision of data services, broadband mobile internet, and for the provision of mobile telephone service qualifies as CP&I. There's dispute over whether that is the case, or whether the fact that the definition of CP&I as which includes a qualifier that it's only CP&I if it's information that's made available to the carrier solely by the provision of telecommunications service, whether that limits the FCC's ability to classify, for example, mobile geolocation information as CP&I. There's within Section 222, there's also arguably a provision for customer proprietary information, which is a broader category of information than CP&I, which is information about a customer's account that doesn't qualify as CP&I. The Commission first articulated the idea that Section 222 protects this broader class of customer information in the Telecom and Yortel NALs. And as was the case where these folks were publishing information that a customer wouldn't expect to be published in an insecure format online, but the information did not qualify. So Section 222 is it's a use-based statute where you are entitled to use and disclose CP&I for the purposes of providing the telecommunication service to which a subscriber has subscribed, and a number of other pre-approved reasons, like preventing use of the telecommunication services for fraudulent purposes, to answer a valid service of process. I'm not going to go through all of the exceptions, but the default rule is you can use it for the things that are approved. If you're going to use it for something else, you need a consumer consent. And there is a two-tier consent process where certain uses and disclosures require opt-in consent, and certain uses and disclosure require opt-out consent. The Cable and Satellite Privacy Act, which is the which is the provision that the chairwoman mentioned as well, is similarly a privacy statute that's use-based, that authorizes certain uses of cable and satellite TV customer information, and uses beyond those pre-approved uses require customer consent. I will also mention one provision that the chairwoman did not mention, which is the broadband transparency rule. There's been a lot of activity on this, but when broadband internet access service became a non-telecom service and information service, again in the wake of the Restoring Internet Freedom Order, there was the Restoring Internet Freedom Order included a provision that maintained certain disclosures that broadband internet access providers still needed to engage in, and that was later codified into Congress. So there is a disclosure requirement for broadband internet access providers, provided for both in a statute and continuing to be developed FCC rules as well. So I am sure others will have different takes on that description, but that's my attempt to be high level and outline the areas of dispute rather than advocating for one or the other.
I do want to add some additional authorities, and not trying to get into, but just different statutes that have also been employed. The first and most important is the 47 U.S.C. 605, which is the oldest. It is part of the original Communications Act of 1934. It builds on traditional common carrier ideas of privacy. In fact, I believe a version of it also appeared in the 1927 Federal Radio Act, which is sort of a general privacy statute that prohibits the publishing of any information about a communication, including the actual fact of the communication. Now, that provision has rarely been invoked. The last time that I remember it being enforced was, if people remember, the Google-Fi case about a decade ago, when Google did drive-bys to map Wi-Fi availability, and they ran into trouble of, the question was whether they'd violated this statute by intercepting other people's wireless transmissions over their Wi-Fi systems, even though they were being essentially broadcast openly because they weren't password protected. The FCC has, however, also invoked, with regard to common carriers, so at this point, telephone and mobile systems that are the common carrier portion of the mobile system. It's Section 201 authority, which permits it to, which prohibits all unjust and unreasonable rates and practices. And the Commission in the Telecom order pointed out that the failing to take basic precautions with regard to the protection of personal information was also a violation of Section 201 for common carriers, and the Commission has suggested in other places that it retains rulemaking authority under Section 201, at least with regard to common carriers, which include, of course, mobile phones for the voice component.
Katrina, we've heard about all these authorities. Let me ask you to jump in. Sort of, what is your take on how the FCC has done in terms of enforcement over the years? I mean, has it used these authorities fully? Is it more it should be doing? I mean, the chairwoman, I think, probably suggested that maybe she wants to do more.
Yeah, the FCC could certainly be more aggressive. They've not really been very active in using their consumer privacy authorities, and even where they've taken initial action in the past, the follow through hasn't really been there. We talked earlier about, and the chairwoman talked about, those notices of apparent liability from 2020 that they issued to the mobile giants for illegally selling subscribers' location data. That was the strongest action we've seen in recent years from the FCC. But as the chairwoman noted, 3 years later, there's been no follow-up. No forfeiture order has been issued. So the fines haven't been collected, and there's really been no consequences for these mobile carriers for these egregious violations of the law. And that lack of action really, it also leaves a lot of uncertainty about whether the legal positions that the FCC laid out in those notices are in effect. If they were, these carriers would be subject to a strict necessity standard for collection and processing of mobile location data, and then they'd be subject to federal and state penalties if they fail to comply, and direct suits by users. But until the FCC moves these cases forward, it's unclear whether that's the standard or not.
I want to push back on that just a little to say we can divide up the FCC's enforcement and use of its authorities into a couple of different phases. The FCC has at times been very aggressive, going back actually to when Kevin Martin, who was Republican, was chair and put in place the existing rules. It was the first agency to have national data breach rules. It was the first agency to have data stalking rules, and a number of things that are the rules that, as the chair rightly said, need an upgrade. But at the time, when they were put in place based on a petition from Epic, this was really aggressive, groundbreaking stuff. The enforcement that followed that until about 2014, 2015 was similar in many ways to what the FTC has done. In some ways, it was very aggressive in the sense that the FCC came after people for failure to file their report certifications, failure to timely disclose breaches, but they went for very small penalties and consent decrees. The idea being that it was more important to remedy the conduct and get the carriers themselves to to engage in training and promise not to do this again, than it was to have serious consequences for the offenses. Then came when Wheeler came in and put Travis LeBlanc in as the head of the Enforcement Bureau, which I personally think of as the golden age of privacy enforcement at the FCC, which resulted in a large number of, for this sort of area of law, groundbreaking decisions and substantial fines. This was followed, unfortunately, by the PI FCC, and I have never seen a chairman display such contempt for his own agency's jurisdiction and rules. He said multiple times he did not think that the FCC should be in the privacy business. He said this is a job for the Federal Trade Commission. The enforcement action that we've been waiting on was the result of massive shaming in the press and pressure from Congress for PI to actually take any action on what were egregious and well-publicized violations. So now we're in sort of a recovery period where we need to get the agency back on track.
Okay. Adrian, Harold alluded to the FTC, and one of the complications in this area is that there's often some uncertainty, and there's been some tug and war a little bit on sort of FCC authorities and FTC authorities. Talk a little bit about sort of how that authority is divided and some of the issues there.
Sure. So FTC, Section 5 of the FTC Act, is probably not news to the vast majority of folks on the call, but they have jurisdiction over the vast majority of the US economy. They have the power to enjoin unfair or deceptive acts and practices in interstate commerce. They also have competition authority that we'll put aside for the moment here. A really important limitation on their jurisdiction, though, is a limitation on the ability to regulate common carriers. And there's been some back and forth in the courts about the scope of that common carrier exemption, but where courts appear to have landed is that it applies to common carriers and the scope whenever they are acting as common carriers. So if you've got someone who's offering a combination of common carrier and non-common carrier services, the common carrier services are regulated by the relevant agency. If you're a communications provider, that's the FCC. If you're a railroad company, that's a different agency. But with respect to any non-common carrier activity, the FTC retains jurisdiction over that activity. And I'm speaking in my personal capacity, but in my former life as a government person, I litigated on behalf of the FTC, and I've seen the great work of folks within the FCC, and I think that there is much overplayed about this jurisdictional divide being a real interagency fight. I don't know that that's actually the case. I think that both the FTC and the FCC want to protect consumer privacy and want to get there however it gets there. But Congress, I think, did throw quite the wrench into things when it issued a resolution of disapproval under the Congressional Review Act of the broadband privacy rule. So let's, you'll have to forgive me as I wonk out for about 30 seconds. Under Chairman Wheeler, broadband internet access service was reclassified as a Title II service. So a telecommunications service. So ISPs, common carriers, switch from jurisdiction of the FCC to the jurisdiction of the FCC. After that happened, the FCC adopted what they called the Broadband Privacy Order, which was not only extension of the CP&I rules to broadband internet access providers, it was also a significant update and big changes to the voice CP&I rules as well, and included things like updating of data breach notification requirements and a wide variety of things, some of which were extremely uncontroversial, and many of which were very controversial. But under a little known before the Trump administration procedure known as the Congressional Review Act, Congress disapproved of the Broadband Privacy Order before it could go into effect. And when Congress disapproves of an item, an agency is barred from, in the future, reissuing any substantially similar order or taking any action with substantially similar effect. So because this broadband privacy order was so broad, and because Congress disapproved of it, and because we have very little case law about the scope of what substantially similar means, there is, I'm personally of the opinion that the CRA significantly limited the FCC's ability to regulate under the CP&I rules. And so enabling the FTC to continue to have authority is something that, in my personal opinion, is not only makes sense and effectuates the intent of Congress, however much I may disagree with it, but also is potentially much more protective of consumers because of the questionable legal authority that the FCC has over ISP privacy. So the idea is that the split is over who regulates it. They're playing for the same team, but their enforcement powers are different. Their ex-ante rulemaking authorities are different between the two agencies. But I think also at this point, it's important to remember that the federal government is not the only player in town. The states have also really stepped up in terms of their enforcement of privacy matters. And so I think it's important to, as we discuss federal regulation, not lose that as a key part of the picture.
So Cody, let's talk a little bit why this matters, in the sense that the FTC put out a report about ISP privacy practices. Tell us a little bit about what that said and what practices that brought to light.
Absolutely, and thanks, Samir. And I do want to respond a little bit to Adrian's point about the distinction between the two agencies. Obviously, the FTC has been incredibly proactive under the Biden administration in promulgating, or at least beginning, the rulemaking process with respect to commercial privacy and data security practices. But the two agencies have very different authorities in that space, where the FTC has to jump through a number of hoops through the Magnuson-Moss rulemaking, which requires almost trial-like procedures and additional rounds of rulemaking and notice, versus the FCC, of course, has to just adhere to your traditional administrative notice and comment procedure. So the FCC has a little bit more flexibility than the FTC does, and that might be pretty essential when you're thinking about privacy in a space that's as technical as broadband or telecommunications. Similarly, their enforcement authorities are a bit different, whereas the FCC has a process of issuing the notice of apparent liability that the chairwoman was referencing earlier. The FTC usually is limited from imposing monetary sanctions for first-time violations, and this is instead limited to cease and desist orders. So although both agencies, I think as Adrian put it, are playing on the same team of pro-privacy, there are functional distinctions between the two that should probably weigh into what agency is better suited for regulating broadband. But nonetheless, we live in a space right now where the FTC is, I think, as Chairman Pai put it, the cop on the beat for broadband privacy. And they did, as you said, Samir, issue a report in 2021, if I'm not mistaken, regarding the data practices of broadband internet providers. And what we saw largely from that report is that broadband providers are participating in the data ecosystem in a lot of the ways that we expect data brokers and other big companies to do so. Collecting information not only based on our use of their services, such as what is our payment information, what is the information that they need in order to just provide basic connectivity, but also identifying the demographics of users, their habits, their location, and then using those not only for first-party marketing, that is to try to sell you a new higher speed broadband connection, but third-party marketing as well. And that's situations where we've seen broadband providers identify people based on their usage, based on other information in certain advertising segments, such as Asian achievers, high income mobility, low income, politically active. These are pieces of information that reveal a great deal about us. And I don't think it's what most people expect from their broadband providers. And that was one of the really eye-opening things about the FTC staff report, was the degree to which, one, broadband providers know about us, and two, how little we are aware of those practices going on in the background.
Has there been any follow-up to that report, either by the FCC or FTC? Sorry, Cody, I don't know if you heard me.
I'm so sorry that you're posing that to the other panelists. As far as I know, there has not been any enforcement actions or anything to that degree. We have seen the subsequent movement at the FCC regarding carriers' use of location data in the notice of apparent liability that we've mentioned already, as well as Chairwoman Rosenworcel's release of the letters about carriers' practices with location information. But it's worth noting too that at least right now it's a house divided, where the FTC is talking about this group of entities with respect to broadband internet connections, which is not a telecommunications service. And the chairwoman's letters, as well as the notice of apparent liability issued by the enforcement division, are about voice service over wireless service over traditional landline telephones. And that's a distinction I think would be lost on your average consumer, that when they pick up their device and use Signal to make a phone call, it falls under one entity's jurisdiction. But if they use it with the phone app instead, it looks very different.
Harold, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, just a couple of things. One, I will point out that report said in a number of places, we really need the FCC in this. The FTC staff said, we do not have the concentrated expertise. We do not have the same overall jurisdiction over these entities. And we really, really wish the FCC were more involved with this. Which is, I agree, everybody's playing for the same team, and there is a strong relationship between the Federal Trade Commission and the Federal Communication Commissions. They have a MOU that has existed for, I think, 2 decades with regard to this, but is important to recognize that the Federal Trade Commission is a generalist. The FCC is a specialist, and I like to describe its jurisdiction as narrow and deep. It does a lot of things, and it is given a lot more authority over a fairly narrow but critically important section of the economy because of the importance of that. As I mentioned before, the provisions governing privacy of communications go back to the first precursors of the Communication Act as common law. They go back even further because without secure and private communications, there cannot be a functioning economy. We have to have trust that when we communicate with people at a distance, that those communications can be confidential, that they will not be disclosed to others, that even the fact of that communication will not be disclosed to others, never mind the circumstances under which those communications take place, which is why we have, since the days of the mail, have always dealt with communications differently. I also have to say, I strongly disagree with Adrian's assessment of the impact of the CRA. I don't want to get too much into that, but the fact is that there isn't any real case law on this. So there's no good way to know whether you read the CRA as a fairly narrow. It says, you shall not pass regulations that are substantially similar. All right, what's substantially similar? It doesn't repeal the law. The agency can pursue by case basis if it wants. Finally, I do have to point out, we spend most of our time talking about 222 and CP&I because that's been the area where the FCC has been most active. But I do want to point out that the Cable Act, the Privacy Act provision of the Cable Act, explicitly states that those provisions apply to information services, which is the legal category of broadband. So starting tomorrow, the FCC could engage in privacy activity with regard to internet carriers that are also cable providers and use the same physical plant that they do under, because the statute there refers to information that passes over the same physical plant. It's kind of an interesting question now that physical plant is also being used for mobile communications by cable operators. But the fact is, the FCC could become a lot more active even without reclassification as Title II. And of course, public knowledge, a number of other organizations have been pushing for reclassification of broadband as Title II. And one of the reasons for that is because it is an incredibly pro-privacy provision, bringing in Section 222. And we think that would be an amazingly pro-consumer and, in fact, a necessary element to any sort of privacy scheme.
So Katrina, I mean, one actor we've alluded to here a little bit, but let's delve in a little bit, is Congress. I mean, Congress is the one that sets some of these jurisdictional boundaries between the FCC and FTC. And last year, it moved a little further than it has in the past in terms of actually trying to do something on privacy from a comprehensive sense with the American Data Protection and Privacy Act that got at least through the House Energy and Commerce Committee. That bill would have changed some of the dynamics around this in terms of who does what in the communications arena. Tell us a little bit about that bill and what it would have done.
Sure, thanks, Samir. And I'll call it ADPA because American Data Privacy and Protection Act is a real mouthful to say a bunch of times. So ADPA would replace the FCC's current CP&I privacy authorities with uniform privacy rules that would apply to all industries. And that authority would move away from the FCC to the Federal Trade Commission. Now, is this ideal? No. Ideally, we'd like to see the FCC and the FTC be strong enforcers in this space. But compromises are made when legislation is being crafted. And what we really need first and foremost are strong, comprehensive rules that force changes to the harmful business practices that are happening today and prohibit discrimination online. And the rules in ADPA are stronger than the current CP&I rules. ADPA sets a data minimization standard that entities can only collect, use, and transfer data that's reasonably necessary for a product or service. And that standard is even higher for sensitive data like location data, health data, data about minors. Then it must be strictly necessary. And that's enforceable not only by the FTC, but state AGs, and also through the private right of action in ADPA. And the FCC would still likely play an advisory role to the FTC. As Harold mentioned, they have an MOU that goes back decades. So they would probably, still have that in place and have insights into the common carriers and telecommunications areas of concern.
Okay, great, thanks. I want to let the audience members know we'll move to Q&A relatively soon. So if you have any questions, you can use either Zoom's Q&A function or the chat function to get your questions in. But
one quick thing on ADPA, because this is important. And I have to say, public knowledge strongly supported ADPA. We also continued to fight to remove the FCC preemption provisions. And there are a couple of things that are important. These would not be uniform laws. Every other federal privacy statute in banking, in health, everything else was protected from this preemption, and law ADPA was complementary. It was only the FCC that was preempted. Why was the FCC singled out among all agencies, and why was CP&I singled out as the only law to be preempted here? Because the cable and telco industry has been lobbying fiercely for this for a decade. Spoiler alert, they are not doing it because the FCC is weaker than the Federal Trade Commission. Now, I agree that ADPA created a number of other obligations, but the plain fact is this was a Republican demand in response to a decade of industry lobbying. And yeah, if that was the compromise that had to be made in order to get a strong privacy law through, that's how the sausage is made. But we should not imagine for 1 minute that throwing out a century of electronic privacy protection and treating communications as unique, as subject to the highest degree of privacy protection, was somehow a good thing, or that somehow ADPA made up for it in other ways. It was a sacrifice in order to get a larger privacy law through. And in an ideal world, you wouldn't treat phone data, the data that people regard as their most personal data, as if it were browser data.
To be continued, I think, if ADPA gets reintroduced this summer. I want to hit two quick other topics quickly, and then again, audience members are welcome to pose some questions. So, Cody, we've talked a lot about CP&I and cable, and a topic that you don't normally associate with the FCC, but I know is near and dear to your heart, is student privacy. And what role does the FCC potentially have in that area?
Thanks, Samir. This comes through the FCC's Universal Service Program, which is a great program that helps provide telecommunications services as well as internet connections to folks who need it through a variety of programs. And one of them is the E-rate program, which is universal service for schools and libraries. As part of the E-rate program, schools and libraries have to adhere to what's called the Children's Internet Protection Act, which was, I think, Congress's third act to protect kids from perceived harms online. And their solution was to require those who receive E-rate funds to filter and monitor school connections. SIPA's filtering provisions have been much discussed, challenged in court all the way up to the Supreme Court, but their monitoring provisions have been much less addressed, including not by the Federal Communications Commission. But what we've seen is an entire industry develop around selling monitoring software to schools in order to surveil what kids are doing online, either it be the messages that they send, their browsing history, or even sometimes their location. Often this is done in order to purportedly comply with the Children's Internet Protection Act or in the name of student safety. But obviously it raises some serious questions about student privacy. And CDT did great work over the past couple of years as we saw kids taking school devices home with them during the course of the pandemic about the impacts of that surveillance on kids. And it was having disproportionate effects on kids who are Black, who are Hispanic, and who are disabled or were LGBTQ+. And CDT had called on the FCC to clarify what it is that monitoring means, because there's good reason to think that SIPA did not envision this sort of sophisticated technological monitoring, but instead the involvement of parents and other trusted adults in helping coach kids in best online practices. We haven't seen any movement on addressing SIPA, despite the fact that it came up in the FCC's recent order around the Emergency Connectivity Fund, but we're hopeful that there will be some movement there to clarify what monitoring actually means in that act.
Great. And because I think the rule is you can't have a tech policy conversation anymore without talking about AI at least once, I'm going to close with a question about AI, which is, and I'll pose this to you initially, Harold. As carriers start to use AI technologies for network management, network efficiency, other technologies like network slicing in the 5G network, where they divide up the network into different slices for different types of traffic, what potential privacy implications could that have?
Well, this is an excellent question. The CP&I statute and the Cable Privacy Act allow for the use of aggregate data, where it generally allows for these kinds of efficiency uses. What you need here is privacy by design. I like to point out that when the FCC mandated GPS in mobile phones in order to make 911 response possible, nobody thought about privacy when they were doing that. It was very early in the game, and it was just a different set of people. It was the Public Safety Bureau. That was a huge mistake. We ended up unintentionally putting a tracking device on every American as the condition of having a mobile phone. So it's imperative at this stage to be thinking about privacy by design as we get into these tools. These tools can be designed to protect privacy and stay within the permissible realm of aggregate information and limited to the proper purposes. But if you don't say it explicitly, then it is certain that industry will want to exploit the data that is collected for inappropriate purposes, and it will be difficult, if not impossible, to put the privacy genie back in the bottle if that happens.
Okay. Great.
So I think if I can respond to that very
Absolutely.
Again, in my personal experience, I think that that's an overly cynical view of industry. But this is a poster child for an area where I do ultimately agree with you that privacy by design is incredibly important, so that we can honor consumer trust, but also enable consumers to harness the benefits of that technology. So there is great consumer benefit to fewer dropped calls, to better connectivity, to all of these things. And it's also a poster child for a place where nuance is going to be really important. each network is different, each AI solution is different, and so putting some ground rules in place may ultimately, I don't know whether, in the abstract might be a good idea. But giving flexibility to make sure that that technology that can make all of our lives better gets to move forward is something that's going to be really important.
I absolutely 100% agree with that there's a lot of potential here for good. Everything from spectrum efficiency improvements to network management improvements. But I will just tack on, and this is also why it is important to have the expert agency that is capable of making these sorts of nuanced judgments, authorized and involved in the process and not preempted.
Well, we'll leave Harold with the last word there. Thank you all so much for joining us and for offering all of these insights. I'm sure the audience gained a lot from it. And thanks again to Chairwoman Rosenworcel for joining us and giving opening remarks, and for her renewed commitment by the FCC to privacy. We look forward to see what comes of that. Thanks again, and thanks everyone for joining us.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.